When people ask me what the coldest thing I've ever done was, they usually expect some story about an ex-girlfriend or a bad business deal. Nobody expects the answer to involve 42 luxury homes sitting in total silence while the outside temperature dropped to 15 below zero. The funny part is, I never wanted revenge in the first place. I just wanted to keep the heat on inside my RV and be left alone. My name's Ethan Walker. I'm 36 years old, and I'm an electrical contractor in northern Wisconsin, about 40 minutes outside Wausau. My grandparents bought our land back in the early 60s when nobody wanted it because it was mostly woods, marsh, and frozen dirt for half the year. They cleared it one tree at a time, built a modest farmhouse that my parents eventually sold after my dad passed away. And when everything settled, I inherited the back 40 acres. Most people hear 40 acres and picture some millionaire ranch owner. Reality looked a little different. I had a fifth-wheel RV parked beside an oversized workshop where I ran my electrical business. 3 service trucks, enough tools to wire half the county, and absolutely no interest in building some giant house just because everyone else thought I should. I liked living small. It meant fewer bills, fewer things to clean, and more money staying in the business. Unfortunately, my land bordered one of those picture-perfect developments where every mailbox matched, every Christmas wreath had to meet some committee's approval, and every lawn somehow looked greener than nature intended. Pine Hollow Estates had oversized homes with heated garages, stone fireplaces that barely got used, and driveways long enough to land a helicopter. The people weren't all bad. A few waved whenever I drove past. One retired couple even bought fresh eggs for me every summer. But there was always this invisible line between them and me. Like my RB reminded them that not everyone measured success by square footage. The biggest problem wasn't the neighbors. It was the HOA president, a woman named Cheryl Bennett. Early 60s, perfectly styled silver hair, white luxury SUV, expensive winter coats, and the kind of smile that disappeared the second she didn't get her way. Cheryl believed rules weren't something people followed. They were something she owned. During my first year after moving into the RV, I probably received 15 violation notices. My work trailer wasn't parked straight enough. My firewood stack was visible from the entrance road. My security lights were too bright. My company trucks looked commercial. Every letter ended with the same line about maintaining community standards, even though I wasn't actually inside the subdivision. I usually laughed, tossed the letters into a drawer, and went back to work. Life's too short to argue with someone who schedules meetings about mailbox colors. Looking back, I think that irritated Cheryl even more than arguing would have. She wanted a fight, and I kept refusing to give her one. Then January arrived. The kind of January only people from the upper Midwest understand. The air hurt your face after 10 seconds outside. Diesel engines complained every morning. Coffee froze if you forgot it in the truck. I spent a long week wiring a dairy processing facility about 2 counties away, sleeping 4 hours a night and living on gas station sandwiches. When I finally pulled into my property just before sunset, I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the truck. The porch light on my RV was dark. That shouldn't have happened. I always left one light burning when I was away. I climbed out, my boots crunching across snow that sounded like broken glass in the cold, and walked toward the electrical pedestal. Someone had wrapped a heavy chain around the service disconnect and secured it with a bright yellow padlock. Hanging from it was a laminated notice sealed inside plastic to protect it from the weather. I remember reading the first line twice because my brain refused to accept it. Temporary electrical service disconnected pending compliance with community winter appearance standards. Fine assessed, $900. Recreational vehicle removal required within 14 days. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably stupid my brain couldn't process it any other way. Then I opened the RV door. The inside felt like an abandoned refrigerator. My breath rolled through the air in thick white clouds. Every faucet had frozen solid. One water line beneath the kitchen sink had already burst, leaving a sheet of ice across the vinyl floor. The thermostat blinked 40 degrees. I just stood there for a minute listening to absolute silence where the furnace should have been running. And something inside me changed. Not rage, disappointment. I'd spent years minding my own business, helping neighbors after storms, pulling stranded cars out of ditches with my tractor, even fixing electrical problems for people in that subdivision without charging labor because that's what decent neighbors do. Cheryl knew exactly what would happen if she shut off power during a Wisconsin winter. This wasn't paperwork anymore. This was personal. I called her before I even started cleaning up the mess. She answered on the second ring, sounding almost cheerful. "Mr. Patience, Walker," she said. "I was wondering when you'd notice. I asked one simple question. Who authorized someone to lock my electrical service?" She didn't hesitate. The board voted unanimously. "Your RV is damaging the winter character of our community." I looked around at my own land, buried under snow, surrounded by pine trees that had been standing there decades before her subdivision existed, and I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "You shut off my heat because you don't like looking at my camper?" She sighed the way teachers do when explaining something obvious to children. "You had plenty of warnings. Sometimes consequences are necessary." I looked at the frozen pipe beneath my sink, then out the window toward the tree line where my grandfather used to walk with me every winter checking old property markers. And I quietly answered, "All right, if we're talking about consequences now, I think it's time I checked something my grandfather left me." Cheryl chuckled. "Good luck with that." She hung up before I could say another word. She thought she'd won. She had no idea there was an old steel filing cabinet sitting in my workshop, covered in 30 years of dust, holding documents nobody had opened since my grandfather passed away. And buried inside that cabinet was one piece of paper that was about to turn the entire neighborhood upside down. I unlocked the workshop, brushed a layer of dust off that old green filing cabinet, and started pulling open drawers I hadn't touched in years. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a man who never threw anything away. Faded tax returns, receipts for tractor parts from the 70s, handwritten notes about fence repairs, faded photographs of family barbecues where everyone somehow looked sunburned even in October. Then I reached the bottom drawer. There was a weathered leather binder with my grandfather's initials burned into the cover. I remembered him carrying it everywhere when I was a kid. At the time, I figured it was just another old farmer notebook. Turns out it was the closest thing our family had to a history book. Inside were property surveys, utility maps, engineering sketches, handwritten agreements, and one folded blueprint that immediately caught my attention because it showed something running beneath our property toward Pine Hollow Estates. I spread it across my workbench and just stared. A 6-inch private natural gas transmission line, installed in 1965, branching into 42 residential service connections. My first thought was that I had to be misunderstanding what I was looking at. Private gas lines weren't exactly something people built for fun. I called my Uncle Frank, who'd worked with Grandpa before retiring. Before I even finished describing the blueprint, he laughed. "Well, I always wondered when somebody was finally gonna remember that pipeline." I asked him why nobody had ever mentioned it. "Because your grandpa never wanted credit," he said. "Back then the county couldn't afford to extend gas service that far, so he paid to have his own line installed for the farm. When those first families built houses nearby, he let them connect because they had kids and wood furnaces weren't cutting it anymore. He figured neighbors ought to help neighbors." I asked the question that had suddenly become very important. "Did he ever sign ownership over?" Frank answered immediately. "Nope, never. He always said generosity ain't the same thing as giving something away." I barely slept that night. By sunrise, I was sitting inside the office of my attorney, Melissa Grant, a property rights lawyer I'd hired years earlier for commercial contracts. She spent almost 3 hours reviewing every document I'd brought, cross-checking county records, utility easements, and archived plats. She hardly spoke while she worked, which made me even more nervous. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, took off her glasses, and smiled the kind of smile lawyers only wear when they're very confident. "Congratulations," she said. "You own one of the strangest pieces of infrastructure I've ever seen." I asked if there was any catch. She shook her head. "The pipeline is entirely on private easements granted to your grandfather. Every maintenance fault sits on your family's land. There's no recorded transfer, no utility acquisition, no perpetual public dedication. Legally speaking," she paused for emphasis, "that entire distribution system belongs to you." I just blinked. "So, what does that actually mean?" Melissa folded her hands together. "It means nobody has the right to use private infrastructure indefinitely for free unless there's a legal agreement requiring it. And according to everything I'm seeing," she tapped the old handwritten note clipped to the blueprint, "your grandfather specifically wrote that access was voluntary and revocable. One thing, Ethan, if you do anything, it has to be completely legal. No games, no sabotage, no intimidation." I nodded. "I'm not interested in hurting anybody." She smiled again. "Good, because the law is already on your side." We spent the next several hours putting together certified notices, Every homeowner would receive exactly the same letter. The pipeline would remain available under a formal lease agreement beginning immediately. Monthly infrastructure maintenance fee, $350 from October through March. 15-year renewable contract. The HOA would reimburse the $2,400 in damages caused by the unlawful electrical shutoff. All restrictions targeting my RV would be permanently removed from the governing documents. Until then, service would remain suspended. Melissa read every sentence twice before mailing them. "This isn't revenge," she reminded me. "This is establishing terms for continued use of privately owned infrastructure." There was one final step. That afternoon, I walked to a small concrete vault hidden beneath a stand of pine trees about 200 yards behind my workshop. I'd walked past it hundreds of times growing up without giving it much thought. The heavy steel lid groaned as I lifted it. Inside sat an aging but beautifully maintained master shutoff valve with my grandfather's initials stamped into the housing. I rested my hand on the wheel for almost a full minute. Part of me hoped something would stop me. Maybe a phone call. Maybe Cheryl apologizing. Maybe somebody realizing how insane this whole situation had become. Nothing happened. I slowly turned the valve until it stopped. No explosion. No dramatic movie soundtrack. Just quiet. I locked the vault again and drove home. By evening, the certified letters had been delivered electronically as advance notices, while paper copies were already moving through overnight mail. The first phone call came less than 2 hours later. It wasn't Cheryl. It was a homeowner named David Larson. Someone had helped wire a detached garage years before. "Ethan," he said carefully, "I got an email from your lawyer. Is this real?" I told him everything. There was a long silence before he sighed. "I didn't even know that pipeline belonged to your family." "Neither did I until yesterday." "You really shut it off?" "Yes." Another pause. "Honestly, after what Cheryl pulled, I can't even say I blame you." The next morning, the temperature had dropped below zero. By 8 o'clock, social media inside the neighborhood was melting down. People were posting pictures of thermostats reading 50 degrees, then 48, then 44. Hardware stores sold out of portable electric heaters before lunchtime. Pickup trucks lined up outside hotels 20 miles away. Around noon, Cheryl finally called. This time she wasn't cheerful. She sounded offended. "You cannot simply cut off natural gas to an entire community." I calmly replied, "Actually, according to 3 county records, 2 surveys, and my attorney, I can discontinue access to my private infrastructure until users agree to legal terms." Her voice sharpened. "People have children. I had frozen pipes. You're holding families hostage. You locked my electrical service in the middle of January because my RB offended your sense of style." She immediately switched tactics. "We'll sue you." Melissa already expected that answer. "You'll lose. Then I guess we'll let a judge decide." She slammed the phone down. That afternoon, things became noticeably more serious. I drove past the subdivision entrance on my way back from a service call and saw half the neighborhood standing outside talking in small groups. Nobody looked angry anymore. They looked worried. Extension cords stretched across snowy driveways toward portable heaters. One family loaded suitcases into an SUV while their 3 young kids climbed inside wearing winter coats. An elderly couple sat inside a parked sedan with the engine running just to stay warm while waiting for relatives. That image bothered me more than I expected. I never wanted regular families caught in the middle of Cheryl's ego. I called Melissa that evening. "Is there another way?" She answered honestly, "There always was." Cheryl could have admitted wrongdoing yesterday. Around 6 the following morning, emergency vehicles entered Pine Hollow Estates. Somebody's carbon monoxide detector had gone off after they started using an old backup heater that hadn't been serviced in years. Thankfully, nobody died, but firefighters began asking questions about the gas system feeding the neighborhood. Cheryl insisted everything was under HOA oversight. The fire marshal asked for permits, maintenance documentation, inspection records, and utility ownership paperwork. She couldn't produce a single page. I heard later that the silence in that clubhouse conference room lasted almost 30 seconds before the fire marshal quietly said, "Ma'am, if your association doesn't own this infrastructure, why exactly have you been making decisions affecting it?" That single question spread through the neighborhood faster than the cold itself. By that evening, homeowners weren't yelling at me anymore. They were demanding answers from the woman who had convinced them I was the problem. When 3 HOA board members resigned before the emergency meeting was even over, I realized something had fundamentally changed. And for the first time since this whole mess began, Cheryl Bennett looked like someone who understood exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. The emergency meeting lasted less than an hour, but it felt like the end of an era. I wasn't inside the clubhouse when it happened, though I heard every detail later from people who had spent years nodding along with Cheryl simply because nobody had ever challenged her before. Apparently, the room started out exactly the way every HOA meeting does. Cheryl standing at the front with her binder full of rules, trying to explain why this entire disaster was somehow still my fault. That lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then David Larson stood up and asked the question nobody had asked before. Did you know shutting off Ethan's electricity could freeze his plumbing? Cheryl admitted she assumed he'd simply leave. Another homeowner asked, did you know his family owned the pipeline? She quietly answered no. Then someone else asked the question that finished her. If you didn't know who owned it, why were you trying to control what happened on his property? Nobody spoke after that. Sometimes silence is louder than yelling. By late afternoon, my phone rang again. Cheryl's voice sounded nothing like the woman I'd spoken to 3 days earlier. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the condescending tone. She sounded exhausted. What will it take to end this? I looked out my workshop window toward the snow-covered trees where my grandfather had taught me to split firewood, fix fence posts, and respect your neighbors because someday you'd probably need them. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone anymore. I just wanted fairness. The terms haven't changed, I said calmly. Every homeowner signs the infrastructure lease. The HOA reimburses the damage your board caused. Every RV restriction targeting my property is permanently removed. And one more thing. She hesitated. What? A permanent property rights committee with one independent seat. Mine. Any future rule affecting land outside the subdivision gets reviewed before you vote on it. There was another long silence. Finally, she asked, that's it? I almost laughed. Cheryl, if I wanted revenge, I would have asked for a lot more than fairness. She told me she'd call back. 6 hours later, headlights began pulling into my driveway one after another. Not police cars, not lawyers. Neighbors, real neighbors. David came first carrying a folder. Behind him were the Hendersons, then the Morales family, then retired school teacher Nancy Collins, then more vehicles until the driveway looked like a community gathering instead of a legal dispute. Nobody argued. Nobody threatened me. They simply walked inside the workshop one family at a time, signed the lease Melissa had prepared, handed over certified checks covering the repair costs, and quietly apologized. Some apologized for voting with Cheryl. Others admitted they had ignored the constant harassment because it wasn't happening to them. One older gentleman shook my hand and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Comfort has a way of making decent people stay quiet longer than they should. At exactly 11:38 that night, Melissa called to confirm the final signed agreement had been received. 42 households. Every signature complete. The amended HOA bylaws had already been filed electronically, with the county removing every restriction aimed at my RV and limiting future authority beyond subdivision property lines. You're officially done, she said. I thanked her, grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my insulated boots, and walked through the fresh snow toward the concrete utility vault beneath the pine trees. The sky was perfectly clear, the kind of winter night where every star looks close enough to touch and every breath hangs in the air like smoke. I unlocked the steel cover and climbed down just far enough to reach the master valve. My grandfather used to tell me that real strength wasn't measured by how easily you could take something away. It was measured by how willingly you could give it back after proving your point. I wrapped both hands around the wheel and slowly turned it open. Somewhere beneath frozen fields and quiet roads, natural gas began moving through steel pipes that had rested beneath our land for more than 60 years. One by one, furnaces across Pine Hollow estates came back to life. I couldn't hear them from where I stood, but I imagined thermostats clicking, burners igniting, children waking up because warm air finally filled their bedrooms again. As I walked back toward my RV, I noticed a white SUV slowing near my driveway. Cheryl sat behind the wheel. She looked over for a moment, gave a small nod that wasn't quite an apology but wasn't arrogance anymore either, then drove away into the darkness. That was the last conversation we ever had without speaking. A few months later, she resigned as HOA president. The new board invited me to attend meetings whenever property issues affected neighboring land, and surprisingly, those meetings became pretty boring, which, honestly, is exactly how local government should be. Today, my RV is still parked exactly where it was that winter. The workshop has grown, the business is doing better than ever, and every now and then, one of those same neighbors stops by with homemade pie, fresh vegetables from a garden, or just to talk while I'm working outside. Funny how respect shows up once pride leaves the room. Looking back, I don't think the biggest lesson was about contracts or property law. It was about what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. My grandfather helped those families because he believed good neighbors looked after one another. Cheryl assumed generosity meant ownership. She was wrong. Helping someone doesn't mean surrendering your rights forever. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by shutting off access to infrastructure my family legally owned? Or did the HOA create its own disaster the moment it decided to weaponize power instead of using common sense? Let me know where you stand in the comments because stories like this always divide people. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or anyone who confused kindness with permission. Trust me, those conversations are always interesting.